The auction yard smelled of dust and desperation, a place where broken things were sold to the highest bidder. Livestock pens stretched across the property. But today the crowd had gathered around something different, something that made even the hardest ranch hands shift uncomfortably in their boots. At the center of it all stood an iron cage, and inside that cage sat a woman the townspeople had come to call the Giant Widow. Her name was Helena, though few people bothered to remember it. She stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and hands that could palm a man's head like an apple. Her face bore the map of a hard life, scars crossing her weathered skin like forgotten roads. She sat perfectly still on the cage floor, her enormous frame folded into itself, eyes fixed on nothing at all. The auctioneer's voice rang out across the yard, but Helena didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The crowd kept its distance. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering warnings about the monster in the cage. Men muttered among themselves about unnatural things, about women who grew too large, too strong, too different. Helena had heard it all before. She had been hearing it since she was 12 years old and shot up past every boy in her schoolhouse. She had heard it when her parents sold her to a traveling show at 15. She had heard it when the showman died and left her to his cruel nephew. And she had heard it loudest of all when her husband, the one person who had ever shown her kindness, was found dead in their barn 3 years ago. They said she had killed him. A woman her size, they reasoned, could easily crush a man's skull. Never mind that she had loved Thomas with every fiber of her being. Never mind that she had wept for 3 days straight when they found him. Never mind that the doctor said it was his heart that had given out, just stopped beating while he worked. The town needed someone to blame, and Helena was the easiest target. Different, dangerous, damned. After Thomas died, his brother claimed the property and sold everything, including Helena herself. She became property once more, passed from one owner to another like furniture. The last man who bought her had been a mining boss who needed strong backs for his operation. He had worked her 16 hours a day in the darkness underground until even her tremendous strength began to fail. When she collapsed one day and couldn't get back up, he had put her in this cage and brought her here, to be sold one final time or destroyed if no one would take her. The bidding started low. A farmer offered $20, thinking perhaps he could use her for heavy labor. Someone else bid $25, laughing as he did so, making a crude joke that sent ripples of uncomfortable laughter through the crowd. The auctioneer encouraged higher bids, but the enthusiasm was minimal. Helena was an oddity, a problem, a reminder of all the things that made people uncomfortable in this world. That's when the cowboy stepped forward. His name was James Thornton, and he had ridden into town that morning on a gray mare that had seen better days. He wore dusty leather chaps and a hat that shadowed his face, and he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent more time with horses than people. He was tall himself, though not unusually so, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of sage. He had been standing at the back of the crowd, watching the spectacle with an expression that gave nothing away. When he spoke, his voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife through butter. $500. The auction yard fell silent. The auctioneer blinked, certain he had misheard. "Did you say 500, sir?" "I did," James replied, stepping closer to the cage. For the first time since the auction began, Helena lifted her eyes. She looked at this stranger who had just offered a fortune for a broken woman in a cage, searching his face for the cruelty she had learned to expect. But his expression was calm, almost gentle, and when their eyes met, he didn't look away in disgust or fear. He simply held her gaze as if seeing another person rather than a monster. 500 going once, the auctioneer called out, his voice rising with excitement. No one else spoke. Who would challenge such a bid for such a creature? Going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the gray hat. Money changed hands, papers were signed. The cage was unlocked, and James stood back, giving Helena space to emerge. She unfolded herself slowly, joints protesting after hours of confinement, and stepped out into the sunlight. She towered over James by several inches, and the crowd instinctively moved back, but James didn't retreat. He simply removed his hat and held it against his chest. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my name is James Thornton. I have a ranch about 2 days' ride from here. I could use help, if you're willing to work. You'll have your own cabin, 3 meals a day, and a fair wage. If you choose to leave after a month, I'll pay for your passage anywhere you want to go. But I hope you'll stay." Helena stared at him, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the cruel punchline that always came. But James just stood there, hat in hand, waiting for her answer. Around them, the crowd dispersed, disappointed that there would be no further spectacle. "Why?" Helena finally asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Why would you do this?" James considered the question carefully before answering. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be seen as human, and because I recognize the look in your eyes. I've worn it myself." He didn't elaborate, and Helena didn't push. She had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. "I'll come," she said simply. They rode out that afternoon, James on his mare and Helena on a massive draft horse he had purchased from a freight company on their way out of town. The horse was the only one strong enough to carry her comfortably. They traveled in silence for the most part, stopping only to rest the animals and eat the simple provisions James had packed. He didn't try to fill the quiet with empty conversation, and Helena was grateful for that. As they rode, she studied him from the corner of her eye. He sat his horse with practiced ease, his movements economical and sure. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a working man. There was a sadness about him, she thought, something that lived behind his eyes even when he smiled at his horse or spoke gently to calm her when they crossed a rushing stream. On the second day, as they climbed into higher country where pine trees replaced scrub oak, James finally spoke about himself. "I had a wife once," he said, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Mary, she was small, delicate, everything people said a woman should be. We married young, full of dreams about building a life together." He paused, and Helena waited, understanding that some stories needed time to tell. "She got sick 3 years after we married. Consumption. I tried everything, spent every cent I had on doctors and medicines, but nothing helped. She got weaker and weaker until one morning she just didn't wake up." "I'm sorry," Helena said, and she meant it. She understood that particular flavor of grief. "After she died, people treated me differently," James continued. "They pitied me, sure, but there was something else. They acted like I was contagious, like loss was something they could catch if they got too close. They wanted me to remarry quickly, to move on, to be normal again. When I wouldn't, when I kept to myself and focused on working my ranch, they started to whisper. Said I wasn't right in the head. Said a man alone like that was dangerous or sad or both." He turned in his saddle to look at Helena directly. "I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control, to be made into something you re not because people are more comfortable with their stories than with the truth." Helena felt something shift in her chest, a wall she hadn't known she'd built beginning to crack. "Thank you," she whispered. They reached the ranch late in the afternoon of the second day. It was a modest operation, a main house that had seen better days. A sturdy barn, several outbuildings, and a cabin set apart from the rest. The land stretched out in rolling hills covered in grass that waved like golden water in the breeze. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still white with snow even in late spring. "The cabin is yours," James said, pointing to the small structure near a stand of cottonwood trees. "It's not much, but it's solid. I've already stocked it with basics. The pump is right outside. And there's a privy around back." Helena slid down from the draft horse, her legs unsteady after 2 days of riding. James didn't offer to help, somehow understanding that she needed to do this herself. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "What work?" "Whatever you're capable of," James replied. "I won't lie, the ranch needs a lot. Fences need mending, the barn roof leaks, firewood needs splitting. There's always more work than hours in the day. But I'm not going to work you to death. We'll figure out a rhythm that makes sense." Over the following weeks, they did exactly that. Helena threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her. Her tremendous strength, which had been treated as a curse for so long, became an asset. She could lift beams that would have required 3 men. She could drive fence posts into hard ground with a dozen swings of them all. She could haul water and hay and lumber without breaking stride. But James never treated her like just a beast of burden. He worked alongside her, showing her the ins and outs of ranch management, teaching her about the cattle and horses, explaining his plans for improving the property. In the evenings, he would often invite her to the main house for dinner, and they would eat together, talking about the day's work or sitting in comfortable silence. Helena began to heal in ways she hadn't thought possible. The constant fear that had lived in her belly for years started to fade. She slept soundly in her cabin, no longer jolting awake at every sound, no longer expecting violence. She found herself laughing at James's dry humor, offering her own observations, engaging with the world instead of just surviving it. One evening, about 2 months after her arrival, they were sitting on the porch of the main house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. James had been quiet all through dinner, and Helena could sense something weighing on him. "Helena," he finally said, his voice careful. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know there's no obligation in it. Your place here is secure no matter what you decide." She turned to look at him, her heart suddenly racing. Was this where he would reveal his true intentions? Was this where kindness turned to something darker? But when James spoke, his words were nothing she could have anticipated. "I've grown to care for you a great deal these past weeks, not as an employee or even just as a friend. I admire your strength, not just physical but the strength of spirit that has carried you through terrible things. I appreciate your kindness to the animals, your willingness to learn, your quiet wisdom. In short, I've fallen in love with you, and I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Helena's mouth fell open. Of all the things she had imagined, this was not among them. "You can't be serious," she finally managed. "James, look at me. I'm a giant. I'm ugly. I'm everything people fear and mock. You could have any normal woman you wanted." James stood and moved to stand in front of her, looking up to meet her eyes. "I don't want a normal woman. I want an extraordinary one. I want you, Helena, but only if you want me to. I'm not trying to save you or fix you. I'm just a man who has found someone who makes him want to face tomorrow. Someone who understands loss and keeps going anyway. Someone who is brave enough to be gentle after the world has been cruel." Tears began to stream down Helena's face, and she didn't try to stop them. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid that this is a dream and I'll wake up back in that cage. I'm afraid that you'll realize what a mistake you've made. I'm afraid that I don't know how to be loved anymore. Then we'll figure it out together, James said softly. We'll take it slow. We'll build something real, stone by stone. And if you decide you don't want this, that's okay too. But please at least give it a chance. Give us a chance. Helena looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. She thought about the past months, about how he had never once treated her as anything less than human, how he had worked beside her, laughed with her, listened to her, how he had created a space where she could simply exist without fear. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. They wed a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch with only the circuit preacher as witness. Helena wore a dress that James had commissioned from a seamstress 3 towns over, made to fit her tall frame. It was the first time in her adult life that she had worn something beautiful that actually fit. James wore his Sunday best and looked at her like she was the sunrise itself. The townspeople, when they eventually heard, had plenty to say about the union. They called it unnatural, scandalous, proof that James Thornton had lost his mind. But the couple on the ranch didn't hear the gossip because they had stopped listening to voices that didn't matter. They were too busy building a life together. Helena discovered that she had a gift for working with horses. The animals, perhaps sensing her gentleness despite her size, trusted her implicitly. She began training the younger stock, developing a reputation that eventually even penetrated the wall of prejudice surrounding her. Ranchers from neighboring properties started bringing their problem horses to her, at first reluctantly, then eagerly when they saw the results of her patient, kind approach. James expanded the ranch operations with Helena as his full partner. They made decisions together, worked together, dreamed together. At night, they would lie in bed and talk about everything and nothing, building the kind of intimacy that comes from truly being seen and accepted. James traced the scars on Helena's arms and shoulders, each one a story she had never told anyone, and he listened without judgment. Helena learned the landscape of James's grief, understanding that his love for Mary didn't diminish what he felt for her but was simply another part of who he was. 2 years into their marriage, a late spring storm brought a disaster that would test everything they had built. The river that ran through their property and several neighboring ranches swelled beyond its banks, flooding pastures and threatening homes. The Dawson family, whose ranch bordered theirs to the south, found themselves trapped in their house as the water rose. They had 3 small children, and the youngest was just a baby. When word reached the Thornton ranch, James immediately began saddling horses to attempt a rescue. But Helena stopped him. The water is too high and moving too fast. The horses can't make it safely, and you know it. Then what do we do? James asked desperately. We can't just let them drown. Helena looked out at the raging water, calculating distances and depths. I can make it, she said quietly. I'm strong enough to fight the current, and tall enough to keep my head above water in most places. I can carry the children out one at a time. Absolutely not, James said firmly. It's too dangerous. You could be swept away, battered against debris. I won't lose you. She took his face in her large hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. And I won't let children die when I have the strength to save them. This is what my size is for, James, not to be a spectacle or a beast of burden, but to use this body that has caused me so much pain to do something that matters. Please, trust me. James wanted to argue, wanted to forbid it, but he saw the determination in her eyes and understood. This was about more than rescue. This was about Helena reclaiming her power, using what made her different for good. Finally he nodded. Then I'm coming to the bank to help however I can. Helena waded into the floodwaters, feeling the current grab at her legs like hungry hands. The water was shockingly cold, and debris rushed past. Branches and fence posts and unidentifiable objects all turned into weapons by the river's fury. But she kept moving, using her height and strength to maintain her footing where anyone else would have been swept away immediately. The Dawson house was a quarter-mile away, and every step was a battle. Twice she nearly lost her footing when the ground gave way beneath her. Once a massive log slammed into her side, leaving a bruise that would last for weeks, but she kept going, driven by purpose and by the knowledge that James stood on the bank believing in her. When she reached the house, the family was huddled on the second floor, the water having filled the ground level. Mrs. Dawson screamed when she saw Helena's enormous form rising from the floodwaters. But Mr. Dawson recognized her and understood immediately that help had arrived. Give me the children, Helena called up, one at a time. I'll take them to safety. She made 4 trips in total, carrying first the baby, then the 2 middle children, and finally convincing the reluctant 5-year-old that the giant lady wasn't a monster but a friend. Each journey was exhausting, fighting the current while keeping a child safe above the water. On the final trip, carrying the parents' few rescued possessions, a surge of water finally knocked her down. She went under, tumbling in the dark chaos, lungs burning, disoriented and terrified. But then she felt the ground beneath her feet again, solid and real, and she pushed up with all her strength. She broke the surface, gasping, still clutching the bundle of belongings, and kept moving. James was there on the bank, wading in as far as he dared to help pull her out. When she finally collapsed on dry ground, he held her while she coughed up river water and shook from cold and exhaustion. You did it, he kept saying. You saved them all. You magnificent, brave woman. You did it. The Dawson family came to the Thornton Ranch the next day, once the waters had receded enough for safe travel. Mrs. Dawson, who had been among those who whispered about the giant widow, stood before Helena with tears streaming down her face. "You saved my babies," she said simply. "You risked your life for people who have treated you poorly. I will never forget that, and I will never let anyone speak ill of you in my presence again." Word of Helena's heroism spread faster than the floodwaters had risen. The story grew in the telling, as such stories do, but the core remained true. The woman everyone had feared and mocked had proven to be the bravest person in the valley. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. People who had crossed the street to avoid Helena now nodded respectfully when they saw her in town. Mothers who had pulled their children away now let them approach to pet the gentle horses she had trained. It wasn't a complete transformation. There were still those who clung to their prejudices, who insisted that Helena was an aberration despite all evidence of her character. But they became the minority, their voices growing quieter as more people came to know the real woman rather than the story they had invented. 5 years after James had bought her freedom from that cage, Helena stood in the doorway of their ranch house, watching the sun rise over the mountains. She was pregnant with their first child, a fact that had shocked the local doctor who had insisted a woman of her unusual physique could unconceive. But here she was, carrying new life, feeling the flutter of movement inside her that promised tomorrow. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as far as they would go and resting his head against her strong back. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About cages," she said softly. "About how I used to live in one made of iron, and then for years I lived in one made of fear and shame. And about how you gave me the key to both." "You freed yourself," James corrected gently. "I just held the door open. You're the one who walked through it. You're the one who chose to trust again, to love again, to believe that you deserved more than what the world had given you." Helena turned in his arms, looking down at the man who had seen her humanity when others saw only a monster. "We freed each other," she said. "You were in a cage too, built from grief and loneliness. We both walked through our doors and found each other on the other side." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming the land they had built together, the home they had made through patience and trust, and the radical act of choosing to believe in each other. In the barn, the horses stirred, ready for the day's work. In the valley below, the river ran peacefully in its banks, all memory of its violence washed away with time. And in the small cabin where Helena had first learned to sleep without nightmares, a window stood open to let in the morning breeze. The child, when she came, would be born into a world that was slowly learning that different didn't mean dangerous, that size and strength could coexist with tenderness, that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. She would grow up hearing the story of how her parents met, of the auction yard in the cage and the cowboy who saw a woman where others saw a monster. And she would understand that the most important thing anyone can do is choose to see the humanity in others, especially when the world insists they look away. But that story was still to come. For now there was just the morning and the ranch, and two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed most: acceptance, partnership, and the simple, extraordinary gift of being truly known and loved anyway. The giant widow had become simply Helena again, wife and rancher and soon-to-be mother, living proof that redemption is always possible and that the cages we find ourselves in, whether built by others or ourselves, always have a door. We just have to be brave enough to walk through it, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, there's someone waiting on the other side, ready to walk forward into the light together.